was set to automatically record, but it didn't. So yeah, okay. So like 1 minute, I'll start it. And then Isabel, if you want to turn your screen off now and then turn it on when you guys are presenting, you'll just be in the background now.
Great. Sounds good.
Okay, I'm gonna start it. Hello, thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to allow a few more minutes for attendees to log in. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to start in about a minute. If you have any technical difficulties, send us a note to programs@urbangreencouncil.org and my colleagues will do their best to support you. Okay, thank you for joining us today. I'm Ellen Honigstock. I'm the Senior Director of Education here at Urban Green Council. And today we have a great event about the New York City Greenhouse Gas Inventory with speakers from the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. And now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Adam, to take it away.
Thanks, Ellen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Urban Green webinar. My name is Adam Scheiber, and I'm the Associate Director of Research here at Urban Green. As Ellen mentioned, we are really excited to bring you a presentation and conversation on New York City's greenhouse gas inventory with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. As you know, we love to analyze data and track progress here at Urban Green, and it's incredible to see so many people interested in this type of nerdy conversation. So let's get started. So before we begin, at Urban Green, we value excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement. So please be mindful of these values during today's webinar. We'd also like to thank Con Ed for making events like this possible. We really appreciate your support. So now onto the program. So I'm going to kick us off with a bit of background and analysis on how Urban Green uses the city's greenhouse gas inventory and how it's connected to our focus on the building sector. Then Anthony Perez and Isabella Brown from the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice are going to give you a behind-the-scenes look into what goes into producing the GHG inventory every year. Finally, we will have a few moderated questions along with Q&A from participants. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to add questions during the presentations, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Great. So you might be wondering why we are starting talking about buildings when this program is about the greenhouse gas accounting for the entire city. Well, this is an Urban Green event. But in all seriousness, buildings make up the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York City. And the buildings and grid are coming together really quickly. So through accelerated building electrification, primarily heat pump installations, makes buildings more reliant on the grid. And also the greenhouse gas emissions associated with grid electricity use impact building owners through regulatory reporting, like Local 97 and some Scope 3 emission requirements that we're seeing come into the market. It's also super important for future retrofit planning for owners and service providers to know the full context of the New York City's electric grid and also greenhouse gas inventory in general. So therefore, it's never been more important to understand the grid, citywide emissions, and buildings together as a system. So as many of you know, New York City has been collecting and tracking building energy use and carbon data for the past 14 years through its benchmarking law. The benchmarking law is required for most buildings larger than 25,000 square feet to report this data annually through what many people know as Local Law 84. This applies to about 50,000 buildings, which represents about 5% of total New York City buildings, but represents a much larger portion of the total carbon emissions from the building sector. And just to give you a flavor of what's in that data, it covers the energy use of buildings, so utility, gas, and electric use, delivered fuels like fuel oil, GHG emissions are reported in there, also building characteristics like square footage, use type, and also other variables like zoning, administrative, and geographical variables. So here's what it looks like when you put buildings and benchmarking data into the context of the entire city's emissions. So on your screen right now, you have New York City's citywide greenhouse gas emissions taken from the Mayor's Office Greenhouse Gas Inventory for 2024. You can see the green box here represents the building sector, and it shows that about 70% of New York City's total emissions come from buildings. And at Urban Green, by combining the benchmarking data with the greenhouse gas inventory, we can show that more than half of building sector emissions come from those benchmarked buildings, which represent 5% of buildings, but represent more than half of the emissions from all buildings in the city. So this shows you the kind of analysis that we can do when we put together data sets, including the benchmarking and greenhouse gas inventory that the city publishes. So that showed you the current state of affairs, but let's look at the progress that these large buildings have shown since 2010. So on your screen now, you'll see on the y-axis the percentage change from 2010 when we started benchmarking, and on the x-axis you'll see each different data year. So if we bring in carbon emissions, it's really impressive. These buildings have dropped carbon emissions by 26% in the past 14 years. Now, for those same buildings, if we look at the change in energy use, it's also impressive. We show a 17% drop in energy use in those same buildings. We put these changes down to energy efficiency work that's happened in buildings, and also the phase out of oil use in buildings, where many buildings in the late 2010s went from using a carbon-intensive fuel like oil to a less carbon-intensive fuel like gas, and thus you see the reduction in emissions associated with that fuel switching. So if you look at the carbon intensity of the electric grid during the same time period, you'll see that it's actually increased by 5% since 2010. And you can see that there's a very steep increase starting in 2020 to 2022 that coincides with the closure of the Indian Point nuclear power station. So this the grid GHG intensity represents how much the carbon value of the electricity that we use from the grid every day. So if we zoom in here on this period right now, we can kind of see the relationship between the building sector, the grid, and emissions. So from 2010 to 2022, the green line here shows you that energy use in building was continuing to fall. But we didn't see the same reduction in carbon emissions from that energy use because at the same time, the grid was getting more carbon intensive. Thus, the electricity use from those buildings was increased. The emissions from the electricity use was increasing while their energy use was going down. So this dynamic really shows the importance of these three factors working together to decarbonize our city. But the good news is that we expect the grid carbon factor to start going down this year as more clean electricity comes onto the grid, which will drive greater emissions reductions and hopefully get these three lines going down together at the same time, which is what we want. So I'm going to, in a minute, the city is going to walk through how they produce their estimate for the greenhouse gas intensity of the grid that we just looked at. But as many of you know, there are different methodologies for calculating the greenhouse gas intensity of electricity we consume, and thus the total emissions of our buildings. So the three most relevant methodologies for New York City building owners are first, New York City's Greenhouse Gas Inventory, which we'll learn about more in a second. The second method is the Environmental Protection Agency's eGrid methodology. The eGrid is different from the other methodologies because it's geographically based. So it looks at the power plants in the specific region, looks at the fuel they use, and comes up with an estimate of the carbon content of the electricity from those power plants. For New York City, that's New York City and Westchester County. So it's looking at the carbon intensity of that specific region of power plants. The third method that many building owners are aware of is the Local 97's compliance period, and specifically the 2024 to 2029 compliance period. Unlike these other two methods, this carbon intensity in Local 97 is set for each compliance period and is tied to forward-looking policy goals rather than the data that comes out each year. So to quickly demonstrate the difference in these two methods, I'm going to show the effect of these three different methods on the carbon emissions from a typical commercial building, large commercial building in New York City. So our example building is a large commercial building. It uses gas for heating and hot water and electricity for cooling, lights, plug loads, ventilations, and elevators. So if you calculate their emissions using New York City's Greenhouse Gas Inventory, you see that they have a total electric emissions of 4,424 tons of carbon per year and gas emissions of 1,060 tons per year. Now, if we do that same calculation with the same energy use for the same building using the EPA eGrid, you see that electric emissions are now 4,993 tons, which is significantly more than when we used the greenhouse gas inventory. And you can see the difference here is this grid GHG value that we're applying. So the grid GHG value calculated by eGrid is higher than the grid GHG value calculated by New York City's greenhouse gas inventory. I'll also point out that you'll see that the gas emissions stayed the same between the two methods because on-site fossil fuel use, burning oil or gas, is not affected by the greenhouse gas value of the grid. And finally, to round things out, if we use instead the Local 97 2024 to 2029 compliance period value, we actually get the lowest electric emissions of all the three methods. And this makes sense because, as you can see, the grid GHG value that is prescribed for Local 97 during this time period is actually lower than these other two estimates. So that kind of gave you a grounding of the grid GHG value and why it's important for buildings. And now I'm going to invite the mayor's office team to kind of dive deeper into the greenhouse gas inventory. So I'm going to ask Anthony to share his screen.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see my screen. I'm Anthony Perez. I'm a policy advisor on the Sustainable Buildings team at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I'm really excited to be presenting with Isabella Brown today, who is a senior policy advisor on the Living Streets and Public Spaces team at MOCEJ. And we'll be presenting on, the New York City Greenhouse Gas Inventory, also explaining how it's not just building emissions that we capture in the inventory. We also look at other sectors as well. And then we'll be, I'll move on to the agenda just to show that, again, we'll talk through some initial 2024 emissions results. We'll go through that inventory methodology, like what goes into the methodology itself, the inventory. And then we'll dive deeper into the New York City Greenhouse Gas Inventory grid coefficient and the calculations and sort of the methodology behind that. And that'll leave some time at the end to go through any questions and discussions that you may have, and we have a couple of moderated questions as well that we'll go over. So diving into our 2024 greenhouse gas emissions results, these are the latest results that we have. This was published in November of last year. We see that the citywide inventory, which considers emissions that occur from activity within the 5 boroughs, plus imported electricity, from upstate in New Jersey and emissions from waste that's exported out of the city. We see that in 2024, there was a 5% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions since the year prior in 2023. And these were driven by fuel oil and natural gas reductions in buildings. Going through a sector by sector breakdown, we see that, again, for buildings, this was the largest decrease. This was the driver of decreases in emissions, the natural gas and fuel oil reductions. For the transportation sector, emissions largely stayed the same. This was due to both an increase in heavy-duty traffic, but also for higher vehicle electrification. So emissions stayed the same for the transportation sector. Waste emissions increased in 2024, and this was due to, although organics processing was expanding, there was an increase in landfilled waste overall. And so this brought down the citywide emissions reductions to 25% from the baseline of 2005. For the city government operations inventory, this considers emissions that are associated with city government operations. There was a 4% decrease in emissions from FY23 in fiscal year 24, and this was driven by the conversion of diesel to renewable diesel for city fleet. Walking through the sector by sector breakdown, we see that buildings saw a decrease in emissions, and this was due to a net reduction in fuel oil and conversion to cleaner fuel and higher biodiesel content. Again, the transportation sector saw decreases, and this was what was driving the decreases for the inventory overall for city government ops, and that was the conversion from diesel to renewable diesel for a city fleet. Streetlights and traffic signals and wastewater treatment plant emissions saw increases, and the former was due to just an increase in energy consumption and the grid coefficient, and wastewater treatment plants were due to variability in venting at DEP facilities. The water supply and solid waste facility emissions saw decreases, and this was due to overall lower energy consumption for water supply and the resolution of a venting system at a DSNY facility for the solid waste facilities. So again, this brought the reductions from year over year were 4% from FY23, and then overall 29% reduction from the baseline of FY 2006, almost 30%. So, why is this important? Why do we track these emissions? Let's dive a little bit deeper into our methodology and our inventory basics. So the purpose is to track the city's progress towards its emission reduction mandates. And those are to reduce citywide emissions by 40% and city government emissions by 50% by 2030. And overall, we have a commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So the inventory really allows us to identify opportunities where emissions can be reduced or further reduced, and our progress towards those goals as well. And this helps support policy development in our office and also implementation for our office, but also the inventory is an input into other city tracking and analyses. And so this is also a factor in the Office of Management and Budget's climate budgeting emissions forecasts, which look at, the implementation of policies, projects, and programs that will, and those implementation, what sort of decreases that'll get us towards our 2050 net zero emissions goal. And then this also helps track towards our local law 97. The inventory uses standardized methods to benchmark against other municipalities, and this is helpful to, again, have more of like an apples to apples comparison between other cities, states, and countries, other entities to be able to compare progress. And according to local law, the greenhouse gas inventory is published every year on November 15th, on around that date. And something really that we want to note, we're currently working on the 2025 inventory, and 2025 will mark 20 years of inventory data reporting, which really shows New York City's leadership and commitment to reporting transparently for the inventory. We are the longest running municipal greenhouse gas inventory, and so just really want to highlight that the legacy of which this work has continued to build on. So where does our inventory data come from? We collect from various data partners. This includes utilities and fuel oil vendors around the city. That's Con Edison, National Grid, and a couple of other utilities. We also collect transportation data from transportation entities like MTA, NIMTIC, the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, and New Jersey Transit for New Jersey Transit activity in New York City. And then we also collect data with other city agencies, government agencies. That includes the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, the Department of Environmental Protection, New York City Public Schools, Sanitation, and the Taxi and Limousine Commission, as well as the US EPA. So to kind of go into a little bit more detail of how the inventory is constructed and what goes along with the, there's this yearly inventory cycle where we dedicate about half a year or even more to reporting this data, to understanding the data and publishing it along our mandated deadline. At the end of every May, we send out data requests to those data partners that I showed in the previous slide. And we typically ask for submissions by the end of June or early July. And while we receive that data on a rolling basis, we begin in June to really do this bulk of data processing. We try to understand, we try to format the data for our analysis. And we also at this point are looking to see if there's any differences from the prior year with the format of our data to be able to, have continuity from the prior years. And so while we're doing that data processing, in July, we do the bulk of a, quality assurance and control. We're asking questions about the data. We really want to try to understand, again, if there are differences, why, and can we consolidate those? And we're asking those questions back to our data partners, and they get back to us, and we move forward with assessing the data, also looking for anomalies, and just trying to understand that a little bit better. So that happens, the bulk of that work happens in July. And in August, we begin looking at the grid coefficient, the electricity grid coefficient. We only have preliminary data that's available in August to be able to estimate the coefficient. And so we use this as a placeholder value in our inventory while we're processing data to be able to continue to, as we move into September, do some more data analysis. And the important part to remember about the interim grid coefficient is that I'll address this in October, but the preliminary data we receive is almost final. And so this is a surefire sort of placeholder that we can use while we're doing a preliminary analysis. But the final data isn't available for the grid coefficient until October. And that's another reason why we published the inventory in November, so that we have this final data set to be able to finalize the grid coefficient in October. So again, that placeholder value is used in our data analysis for September, and we're analyzing trends. We see this, sector by sector outlook. We're looking at drivers of change, and we're trying to see, well, what's the data story here that the data is telling us, and that's when we do the bulk of that data analysis work and come up with our preliminary and almost final findings. In October, when that final, data set is ready for the grid coefficient, we, essentially replace the placeholder value, the interim grid coefficient, and we finalize the grid coefficient, and we're able to, finalize that data analysis, so that in November, our mandated deadline, by November 15th, we can publish the inventory on the New York City MOCEJ website. And we also publish the inventory data on Open Data, which is New York City's, open data sharing platform. And then in December, we begin sort of our results share out internally and externally. We go on this roadshow to present results, and we're in July presenting on the 2024 inventory. So that sort of continues from December and onward into the next year. So that's a little bit more about the inventory, and you can see that we dedicate a lot of time and effort into processing the data, understanding the data, collaborating on it, and again, this sort of continues this legacy of 20 years of inventory tracking and reporting. So now I want to pass it on to Isabella to go a little bit more into detail with the New York City grid coefficient.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. As Anthony mentioned, the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice calculates our own grid coefficient. Both Adam kind of already previewed how those coefficients are different, and now we'll go a little bit into where that methodology comes from. So first and foremost, where does New York City's electricity come from? One of the most important things to understand is that New York City imports electricity from outside the city to meet demand. So we are always going to be a net importer of the electricity that we use. And the reason that is we, simply do not have, we have, a large amount of power demand and we don't have enough space to site all the power plants needed to power that demand. So because of that, we import electricity from outside the city. Regarding the generation in New York City, most electricity generated in New York City is powered by fossil fuels. Transmission lines deliver electricity from fossil fuels and clean energy power plants located across New York State and New Jersey, around the state and both into the city. So what you're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen here is a NYSO transmission system. NYSO, for those of you that don't know, is a New York independent system operator who operates and kind of manages these transmission lines. You can see how they flow power basically across the state and also how they flow power from upstate into downstate and into New York City specifically. One thing you might hear a lot when talking about electricity in the grid is congestion. Transmission congestion, and what we literally mean is what you're looking at the bottom of that image here, where there are just so many lines coming into New York City, and it is logistically and for many reasons difficult to get more transmission lines to get more of the upstate clean energy into New York City. So we can move into the next slide. So we basically look at that system and have worked over the last 20 years of this inventory to develop a grid coefficient that reflects that reality. We don't just use the electricity that's generated in the city, but we also depend on things happening outside of the city. So for our grid coefficient, which when we talk about grid coefficient, right, that's the carbon intensity, the greenhouse gas intensity of the electricity we use. We use a couple of input data sources, many from the US EPA, including clean air markets data, EIA data. We also use data from NYSO, as we mentioned, and utility data from Con Ed as well to account for cogeneration. These are all the same input data sources that you see going into things like eGrid, but they are used a little bit differently to reflect our reality. So on a very high level, just to talk a little bit about what assumptions go into calculating the grid emissions intensity. There's a couple of rules that we use in our modeling. Number one, we assume that 100% of the power generated in New York City serves New York City. So all the things that we generate here, we use. Number two, we assume that we are able to track, and anybody here is able to track if you go online on NYSO's website, the power that gets transmitted from New Jersey over to New York City. So there are a couple of transmission lines, two specifically, and we assume that all of that electricity that moves through those transmission lines from New Jersey to New York City, we use. So we assume it's not going anywhere else. And then we basically look at all of the power that we used over the course of the year. We take out what we generated in the city, what we got from New Jersey, and then of that remaining demand, we assume that about 60% of the remaining demand goes from upstate sources and 40% of the remaining demand goes to Westchester and the Hudson Valley. By those two categories, if you're looking on the right-hand side of the screen here, we're looking at capacity zones. These relate to how NYSO kind of categorizes like zones across the state. Zones G, H, and I that you can see there for us reflect this Westchester and Hudson Valley. All the other zones, A through F above, reflect that kind of upstate sources. So this split really came after the closure of Indian Point, where we saw, Indian Point was in Westchester. As it closed down, we saw that, from our remaining demand, it was more like 60% coming from upstate and 40% now coming from zones G, H, and I, because there just are not um, uh, major sources there that are supporting New York City in the way that Indian Point was. One of the other big things is that Long Island Power. We assume that we don't get any imports from Long Island, just which is Zone K, and that's really because Long Island, similar to us, is a net importer and goes through its own process of getting its electricity. Okay, so how does that all kind of play out? So here we're looking at the distribution of power serving New York City's load. So this is really looking at where do we see our electricity coming from over the since 2005. Um, uh, One thing that is kind of has been sort of consistent is that New York City generation, what we generate within the city, has always served about half of our New York City's demand. You can see Indian Point closure. It really went from like 2020 to 2021 is when the closure began, but basically from 2019 to 2021 is when we really started shifting away from Indian Point. Um, you can see at that moment in 2019, the New York City sort of darker green portion of the grid became a little bit began to grow in terms of the amount that it provided for New York City. So where New York City's generation used to serve about half of our grid, it now serves about 60% of our grid. And that really is happening across the board, where most of the generators and power plants in New York City started generating more after the closure of Indian Point. One of the other things that we saw was the impact of New Jersey. So as Indian Point came offline, those transmissions we were talking about coming from New Jersey started to pick up. And that's that yellow sliver there where you can see New Jersey's kind of portion and impact our grid has become a lot more significant since the closure of Indian Point. And then you can also see that impact of Indian Point on Westchester, Hudson Valley, the light blue area. It used to serve about 20%, 25% of our grid. That now is down to more about like 10% of our grid. And then upstate has been kind of consistent and just sort of consistently served about 20% of our grid over the course of time. So really the impact of Indian Point came down to increases for New York City and New Jersey and decreases for the Hudson Valley region. Great. So what does that mean for us? Unfortunately, and I think this is something that was expected. There are many reasons why Indian Point closed that had to do with that facility in itself. It did, and we're not really here to speak about the closure, but the result of that was a reduction of zero emissions energy on our grid. So we break down zero emissions into kind of two categories. One is nuclear, which is in the dark blue. You can see again, we're going to kind of tell the same story here, but in a different way. That dark blue nuclear was taking up about 20% of our grid up to 2019. And then as Indian Point closed, that went down to about more like 10%. And in addition to nuclear, we also have non-combustion renewables, which is hydro, wind, and solar. That's in yellow. You can see it is slowly increasing, but the gains there are much smaller and really speaks to why we need large-scale renewables. Um, uh, so about 20% of our grid is fueled by zero emission sources. 80% is fueled by fossil fuels. The vast majority of that at this point is natural gas. As you can see in the black portion of this grid, we have had a lot of success phasing out heavy fossil fuels like coal and fuel oil power plants on our grid over the last 20 years, and they are nearly non-existent. One of the things you have seen, though, is that a lot of that has been taken up by natural gas. And if you remember in our last slide, we have been relying more on in-city generation, and most of in-city generation is natural gas power plants. So that's kind of how we get to this split. One thing you may hear a lot is this kind of tale of two grids. Upstate New York has a very clean grid and has a lot of access to hydro and solar. Downstate, we are kind of still relying on these natural gas power plants, and that kind of goes to these transmission constraints, this congestion, the lack of space, and really sort of speaks to the importance of projects like Chippy, and which is a hydropower project coming down from Hydro-Quebec, and Empire Wind, which is an offshore wind project. So really making sure not just that we have clean, large-scale renewable projects, but also that we have the transmission line infrastructure in place to really make sure it can get to the city. Okay, so that was a deep dive into the New York City Greenhouse Gas Inventory coefficient. But we wanted to kind of come back to how Adam, began this in the first places, which is how does this differ from the other coefficients that you may know about or you may hear about, especially if you're in the kind of like inventory accounting space. So as we spoke about, our inventory coefficient covers New York City and Westchester generation, but it also looks at New Jersey imports and the upstate imports as well. It is more of an annual retrospective, modeling the generation, transmission, and electricity imports. And our kind of like most available data year is for 2024, as we spoke about. The 2025 data will be coming out in November. Local Law 97 is kind of operating on a very different timescale. And I'm sure many people on this call know a lot about Local Law 97. The coefficient for Local Law 97, specifically for the period that we're in right now, which is 2024 to 2029, is based more so on New York City and Westchester generation. So it does include the piece about Indian Point. It is a default Local Law 97 compliance coefficient fixed in 2019 to provide regulatory certainty and support building capital planning. And so what we're really talking about here is like, why is this number fixed to a year in the past if it's representing 2024 to 2029? As you can see, and as many policymakers saw, these few years since 2019 were in a highly variable state. And I think one of the things that we wanted to, or the intention of the law was to not penalize building owners for the closure of Indian Point, hiking up that coefficient when, we knew that clean energy sources were going to be coming back online. And a lot of what we see with Chippy is really to kind of bring that coefficient number back down to where we were at Indian Point. And so by 2029, hopefully, the plan is that the inventory coefficient and Local Law 97 are sort of back in the same place. Again, it doesn't really represent today's grid mix for those policy reasons. And as many of you know, other coefficients come after 2029 for the other periods moving out towards 2050. The last version of this is the New York City eGrid. It is called NYCW subregion, and that's because it doesn't just represent New York City, it also represents Westchester generation. And this is really, based off of the federal EPA values, a U.S. regional zones, really developed to track power plant emissions within a set subregion. So the biggest thing to come away with here, right, is when you're looking at eGrid, you are looking at the generation in one place and the generation mix of one place. You're not necessarily looking at the imports of electricity that come into that place. And that is really the big thing that differs us. One thing to note here is I think the latest available data for eGrid is 2023 at this moment. And so, both are really valuable numbers, but they all of these are really valuable numbers. They all just really represent different use cases. And so we kind of want to just close out with a look ahead for the New York City electricity grid. Chippy became operational in May of 2026, delivering over 1,000 megawatts of power annually. And that again is the Hydro-Quebec Champlain Hudson Power Express, which is a direct transmission line coming directly from Canada to New York City to transmit hydropower. Empire Wind 1 is expected to become operational in 2027. That is a large offshore wind program that is coming online. One thing that we do continue to flag both for our private and public partners is that these interim, emission reduction mandates that we talked about for 2030 are here and fast approaching. There is a lot of urgent work to be done. And there is, of course, a huge need for this as we try to kind of pivot towards this kind of new normal. And it's really crucial to reflect developments in the electricity grid in the New York City Greenhouse Gas Inventory coefficient. Our hope here is to capture as much as possible as what is happening in the real world. So I think that's it for us. I wanted to thank you so much. And again, thank Adam and the team at Urban Green Council for inviting us to share out. And then
Awesome.
I think we can move to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Isabel and Anthony. That was lovely to see the behind the scenes, and I think our audience really, really enjoyed that. So now we have a few moderated questions, which I'm going to mix in. Thank you for sending in all the questions. I've been monitoring that. So the first question I want to unpack with the MOCEJ team is about the 2024 GHG inventory. So it still shows that we get about 20% of New York's electricity from zero carbon sources, primarily nuclear. But this might be somewhat confusing about where this is coming from with the closure of Indian Point. And I think we had some questions around the Hudson Valley and Westchester 60-40 split. So Isabella, could you maybe give us a little more context on like how those renewables are still coming into New York City?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like we talked about, there are certain power plants and generators like what we use in New York City and, what Indian Point was that are really significant for New York City, especially because of the way transmission lines are set up. That being said, as we spoke about, we still do get about 20% of our electricity demand from upstate. One thing you may know about upstate is has a lot of, a really significant amount of clean energy. There are about 7, I want to say, other nuclear facilities that are upstate that are still in operation. And so that accounts for that kind of like remaining portion of our grid mix. And then same with some of those, hydro and solar, I want to say, especially portion of our grid, we assume a lot of that is coming, or we know a lot of that is coming from upstate generators. One other thing to mention about our methodology is when we do this modeling, we really go generator by generator, looking at every single generator in the state, how much it produced, and go through a modeling process with our subcontractor, which is PowerGem, to estimate what portion of that generator we think served the city.
That's awesome. So that 60-40 split is kind of an ongoing process that you review every year, right?
Correct. Yeah. So the 60-40 split, it actually has changed over the course of time. So back when we relied on Indian Point, we actually assumed like 60% of the remaining demand came from Westchester and 40% came from upstate. Then that moved to kind of 50-50 as it was closing out. And now we're like kind of at the opposite, where we assume 60% comes from upstate and 40 from Westchester. And that really comes from some proprietary software that our subcontractor PowerGem has, where they essentially model out. It's like a massive market model to estimate and try to model out where demand in electricity is getting bought and sold. One thing that you'll learn about the grid is more of a black box than you might assume. And a lot of it has to do with kind of like the market dynamics and the economics as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. So now turning to the non-electric side, a question for you, Anthony. So 2024 seems like a really exciting turning point for the city. We saw a significant reduction in natural gas use, seems to be driven by, it looks like a 12% reduction in natural gas in the residential sector. So can you maybe talk through this change and like what kind of data analysis do you do to see these changes?
Yeah, I think it was an overall 12% reduction, right, for natural gas overall from 2023 to 2024. And yeah, this was one of the biggest findings that I think this last inventory sort of demonstrated. And again, so we wanted to dig in a little bit more, and we analyzed the data, normalized it due to changes in weather to see if this was consistent to changes with pandemic and population impacts that happened over the last 4 or 5 years. And yeah, we continue to see natural gas reducing. And this is something that both utilities, or natural gas utilities, National Grid and Con Ed, reported. And we could see those reductions were reported from data from both those two utilities. And again, yeah, we saw that residential buildings were sort of driving these reductions. And this is something that we also dove a little bit deeper into the local law 84 benchmarking data, and we see that that also reflects some reductions in natural gas for 2024. Working with Urban Green and seeing other analyses, we're getting this is driven by, energy efficiency upgrades in buildings. We're seeing that, over the course of the last few years, buildings have been able to complete their upgrades. And so just overall, like building energy use has decreased. And so we'll continue to monitor this in 2025. I think that's something that we're definitely clued into for this year while we're doing the inventory, and we want to see how this trend progresses. And we'll definitely be staying, we're very interested in understanding how that continues and what we'll see in future analyses. So that's kind of what went behind understanding this this a little bit more. And thanks, Adam.
Awesome. Yeah. No, it's exciting actually. Kind of the impetus for this webinar was a MOCEJ coming to us and asking about, have we seen similar results in the benchmarking data with decreased natural gas use? And we had done an analysis where we looked at it kind of region by region for the city, and we saw some kind of areas in big buildings that looked like they had made significant energy efficiency upgrades on their gas systems. So this was kind of the impetus of working together and seeing this kind of building level data and top level data come together to tell a pretty important story. So Isabella, we have a lot of questions about the upcoming renewables and any projections that we might have for what they're supposed to deliver to the grid. I think you mentioned that the Champlain Hudson Power Expressway, Chippy, is meant to kind of replace Indian Point in a way, but can you maybe give us a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, exactly. I saw some of those in there as well and also with respect to kind of like the 97 coefficient. So, um, uh, it is supposed to kind of account for people are saying, always about like 20% reduction of that coefficient. That is kind of what we saw that, after Indian Point, our coefficient sort of saw a similar increase. And so the thought is that once, Chippy is fully, operational for a year, we'll sort of be back where we were with respect to Indian Point. And so we'll probably see those reductions. I think in terms of getting to, 70% or 100% non-combustion renewables or, zero emission sources, I think that's where we need more large scale projects. So basically, Chippy will bring us back to we were with Indian Point, but with hydropower. Empire Wind will have some reductions, but we still need to see kind of larger commitments also across the state to make sure that we can meet our goals. One of the things that we talked about, a lot of these things have to do with transmission lines, power plants, other generators in other parts of the state, and that's where really like collaboration with the state and also trying to build as much within Zone J, which is in New York City, is kind of how we're going to try to get there.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so then kind of like, I think just speaking to this like widening gap with the 97 coefficient, we actually don't think we'll see a widening gap. We think the 97 coefficient is below where we are right now, but with Chippy, we will kind of meet it. So by 2030, we will kind of like by 2029, we will be there. And Empire Wind will hopefully get us to like where we're at with the 2030 coefficient. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And yeah, we did some urban green analysis earlier this year as well that looked like when Chippy and Empire Wind are fully operational, about half of New York City's annual electricity use will likely come from zero carbon sources, which I think is is really exciting. So yeah, that's great to hear. A quick just technical question. I think I saw in the Q&A bit about 100-year versus 20-year global warming potential. Can you all maybe talk about how you guys use that in the inventory?
Anthony, I'll let you go for it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we do use the 100-year global warming potential for the both citywide and city government inventories. Previously in the past, we've also reported with the CLCPA standards, and so that was 20-year global warming potentials, and that's something that we can easily update within our workbooks. But according to, I saw there was also some questions about the protocols that we use, and for a citywide, that's the global protocol for cities, and that's aligned with that protocol, and the city government is the local government operations protocol, the LGOP. And so that's the value that we use in the inventory that we publish and that we shared today is the 100-year global warming potential.
Yeah, and if I could just share one other thing about that piece of the global protocol for community-based emissions, which is a real mouthful. When Anthony said earlier in the slides, we use this to standardize across other cities. That methodology is what other cities use. It's kind of like the IPCC or C40 version of IPCC. So it's like the standard method for cities, and that does require 100-year global warming potential. So that is why we continue to report with that. But in the last 3 years, we've reported with both. So the 20-year global warming potential and 100-year in separate reporting mechanisms, just so we can kind of have like different perspectives on the data.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Another category question I'm seeing is around maybe non-electric demand questions. So maybe talking about battery storage or energy efficiency, or fuel oil reductions. Can you talk maybe a bit about how you guys track like battery installations or fuel changes and stuff like that that's not on the electric side?
Yeah, Anthony, do you want to go for the fuel oil piece? And I
Yeah,
can talk about
sure. Yeah. So we receive fuel oil data from our fuel oil vendors. We ask for the heating oil deliveries that happen within the 5 boroughs. And so, we've worked closely with a lot of fuel oil vendors with the city to ensure that they report this data to us, that it is local law that they disclose this data for us. And, over the past few years, there was also this local law that was phasing out fuel oil number 6 and number 4. And so, we can see with the data, this due to the what we receive from our vendors that, this fuel oil has largely phased out, according to the local law, fuel oil phase out legislation. And so that's just a little bit more behind where we receive the data, how we can track that over time, and we can really see that our fuel oil number 6 and number 4 have greatly reduced, and by casualty, the number 2 has also been reducing as well. So that's a little bit more on the fuel oil data tracking, and then I'll let Isabella speak to the battery storage.
Yeah, and on the battery storage side, so that does in some way come into play when we do some of the grid coefficient modeling. That does get tracked in many of the data sets that we use as well. But really, the battery storage side is like it's almost in the background because it is kind of either accounts for like the electricity that gets used or for like supports on the grid, not as much, and when we're looking at like building usage, we're looking at like what the building is pulling in, how much fuel oil it's using, how much gas it's using. So it is there, but it's kind of like on the side. Other folks in our office do actively track how much storage is in the city, as well as, how much solar is in the city, other pieces like that.
Great. Yeah, that's good to hear. And then one question I'm seeing, maybe going back to how we started this with the relevancy for building owners and the different methodologies. I don't know if you'll be able to speak to this specifically, but do you know any guidelines behind how building owners can use the greenhouse gas inventory that you put together for any reporting on ESG goals, carbon reduction, or as you can see, it's a more accurate representation of what they're using. So do you have any advice for building owners on how they can use this data?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like we said, it kind of comes down ultimately always to the methodology you're using. Think that the GHG protocol is pretty adamant about using eGrid. That's my thought, but I haven't been in the corporate world, accounting world for a bit. But one place that this does come into play, our office also hosts a sort of program called the Carbon Challenge, where it supports, building owners and especially large scale institutions like hospitals, universities. I see some people in the chat here who are part of that. That program does utilize these coefficients and does kind of is able to track on that level. One other thing I'll say, Danielle put our link to our inventory page on our website in the chat. That does our electricity coefficients are on that page, and we are also happy to share. But again, I think it ultimately comes down to like checking with the methodology used. So yeah, staying aligned with that.
Great. I think that's it for questions. And if there's Isabel, Anthony, is there anything else you'd like to say? Or if not, we can kind of move on to closing remarks. All right.
No, just yeah, feel free. We will share out our information, but we try to be as transparent as possible with this inventory, and we're really eager to collaborate with outside partners. So yeah,
Yeah, and
but
all I,
Adam,
I want to say is thank you too, and also just stay tuned for the 2025 inventory, which will be released, later this year, and we can hopefully have more conversations like this in the future. Thanks.
Great. No, thank you so much, Isabel and Anthony, for taking the time. I think this is really valuable information for our audience. So I'm just gonna bring some slides back up to share real quick. So just before we go, so before we go, I'd just like to again thank our sponsors, Con Edison, for making really important content like this available for the public. I'd also like to remind everyone that Greenbuild International Conference is in New York City this year, which is very exciting. Urban Green is working behind the scenes to help put on this amazing event. So the registration is open. Early bird pricing is open until August 7th. So you can do the QR code or go to greenbuildexpo.com to register. Also, as part of the Green Build, Urban Green Council's Gala, which I know many of you have been to, is part of that. So we invite you to please look at the gala. We want you to come. It's going to be a great conversation. If you want to talk about the electricity coefficient of the grid anymore, this is going to be the audience for you. So we invite you to please use this QR code or go to our website to register for the Urban Green Gala. And finally, a really exciting new offering from Urban Green. We have a new course called Match Made in NYC, Choosing the Right Heat Pump for Your Building. So this is based off a really successful course that we had for New York State. So we've added in some New York City specific examples and some very specific New York City content to make this available and more relevant for your New York City audience. You can see we have some upcoming sessions in July, so please go to our website or use the QR code to register for this exciting new class. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time this morning. Stay cool in this heat wave, and we'll be talking soon.
thank you.
Thank you.